Well, hello everyone, and a warm welcome to our digital event as we mark LGBTQ History Month and celebrate the lives and work of some of the LGBTQ figures represented within the Royal Collection. It's such a pleasure to have you all with us. Before I introduce our speaker, I just have a couple of housekeeping points. So auto-generated closed captions are enabled for this evening's event. If you wish to use them, you just need to click on the button at the bottom of your screen. And we do have some time for questions at the end of our evening. Throughout the event, please do put any questions for our speaker into the chat function, which you'll find also at the bottom of your screen, and then I can pose them on your behalf. And so without further ado, it's a really great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Alistair Quidt, who is Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings at Royal Collection Trust. Alice.
Hi everyone, I'm Alice, Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings here at the Royal Collection Trust. I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a bit of a cold, so I might have to take a few breaks for water throughout this, but hopefully it will all be fine. I'm just going to share my screen with you so you can see my slides. Here we go. So it's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to you this evening and to be celebrating LGBTQ+ History Month here together. Diverse forms of love and identity have always existed, but they have all too often been left out of history or rewritten entirely. February gives us an opportunity to resurrect this history, bring it to the fore and celebrate it. So often when we look to the past, we look for similarities and we're comforted when we find them. And it's why it's so important to speak about the lives and the output of queer artists and figures. It anchors us to a long history of queer identity. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about a range of artworks that help build that feeling of continuity. We'll start in Florence, where during the 15th and 16th centuries, same-sex relationships between men were common. These relationships tended to be structured by age and were typically between an older unmarried man in his 20s and 30s, and a teenager. Though these relationships were common, and despite Florence being an intensely homosocial society, they were not tolerated. The Florentine government established the Office of the Knight in 1432, which was a magistracy established to prosecute men accused of sodomy. Punishments comprised of fines for the first 4 offences, with the cost rising for each repeat offence. On the 5th offence, the punishment was death. The wealth of surviving archival evidence from the office's investigations provides us with a record of same-sex desire, as well as its persecution. The men listed in the records are from all levels of Florentine society, from members of the great banking families through to artisans and artists. In 1476, Leonardo da Vinci was brought in front of the Office of the Knight, anonymously accused of engaging in sexual acts with Jacopo Saltarelli, a goldsmith's apprentice. It was claimed that Saltarelli had been a party to many wretched affairs and consents to please those persons who exact certain evil pleasures from him. As an anonymous accusation, however, the report was not accepted and the charge was dropped on the provision that Leonardo was not accused again. We find very little other evidence of Leonardo's sexuality, though we know he never married and lived instead with male companions, most notably his pupils Gian Giacomo Caprotti and Francesco Melzi. Melzi described Leonardo's feelings for his pupils as a deeply felt and most ardent love. Caprotti lived with Leonardo for 29 years. He was described by the contemporary biographer Giorgio Vasari as a very attractive youth of unusual grace and looks, with beautiful hair which he wore curled in ringlets and which delighted Leonardo. This drawing by Leonardo was created around 1510, and it shows a sort of happy, smiling, curly-headed youth. It's on red chalk, on red prepared paper, with these touches of black chalk in the hair to create a sense of depth to the corkscrew curls. And Leonardo captures a very faint, suppressed smile and a clear, untroubled gaze. We're clearly looking at someone who has a sense of ease, familiarity, and a comfortable life ahead of them. Drawings like these of curly-headed youths appear throughout Leonardo's notebooks. They were produced as independent drawings. They weren't produced for a project or for a painting, but as an exercise purely for Leonardo's own pleasure. Although these drawings are not portraits of Caprotti in the literal sense, they demonstrate the enduring impact his features had on Leonardo's version of the ideal of male beauty. Francesco Melzi was Leonardo's other main pupil. Melzi worked with Leonardo from around 1505. He was a talented artist in his own right and was Leonardo's primary assistant for the last decade of the artist's life. This drawing, attributed to Melzi, is the only reliable surviving portrait of Leonardo. Earlier biographers described Leonardo as handsome, with a beautiful head of hair down to the middle of his breast, in ringlets and well arranged. And at the lower portion of this portrait, we can see that the smooth strokes of chalk that build up Leonardo's hair give way to this more forceful, lively, curling stroke. We think that these enlivening strokes were made by Leonardo himself, and you can imagine him leaning over Melzi's shoulder, looking at the portrait that's being produced of him and saying, "Oh, come on, Melzi, just give it a bit more life. Let's get a bit of movement in this hair here." And he's making improvements on the sheet. The corners of the sheet have been clipped, they're shaped to be mounted and displayed, and the paper has been discolored from exposure to light. All of these signs point to the likelihood that the drawing was framed and hung by Melzi, displayed as a memento of his master. Towards the end of his life, Leonardo produces a series of drawings of deluges, of massive storms that sweep through valleys and destroy towns and forests and all that stands in their wake. These drawings are sort of accompanied by writings by Leonardo, where he explains what happens when a massive storm sweeps through all of humanity. And you get a sense in these writings that Leonardo is gaining a sense of comfort from the idea that nothing lasts and that everything gets swept away. And you maybe get a sense as well that Leonardo is looking back at the achievements of his life. You know, he's tried and failed to publish books about anatomy and painting. He has frescoes that are already crumbling off the walls. He's tried repeatedly to make large equestrian statues and always been thwarted. And maybe he's making these drawings as a sense to gain a sense of comfort from them, to think that, yes, maybe I haven't completed everything I want to do, but imagine if a massive storm swept away everything. Nothing really lasts, nothing is permanent. For Leonardo, his legacy was really held in his drawings, however, not in the artworks or the publications that he didn't quite complete. And these loose drawings and notebooks were given to Melzi as Leonardo's principal heir. The biographer Vasari wrote that Melzi held this mass of material dear, keeping the papers together as if they were relics. Over the next 50 years, Melzi attempted to put Leonardo's drawings and notes in order, arranging them and the loose sheets by subject matter, and annotating each of them with numbers. And you can see here on this beautiful study of a woman's hands by Leonardo at the very bottom, the number's 210, and these are Melzi's numbers. You can find Melzi's numbers on almost all of the sheets in the Royal Collection by Leonardo. And that Leonardo decided to leave his intellectual and artistic legacy to Melzi really is a testament to the depth of trust he had in the young man. Without Leonardo's works on papers so carefully preserved and looked after by Melzi, we would have very little trace of Leonardo as an artist. He really would have been swept away and lost to that deluge that he drew again and again. We'll stay in Renaissance Italy for now and move south to Rome, where in the 1530s, the painter, architect, and sculptor Michelangelo was working. Michelangelo's love for men was an open secret amongst his contemporaries. One of his contemporaries recounts the artist saying, "Every time I see someone who shows some talent of intellect, I see myself compelled to love him and do so in abandonment, so that I am no longer myself, but all his." In an early biography of Michelangelo, this ardor is couched in classical Platonic terms. The author stresses that though Michelangelo loved the beauty of the male human body, this was a love not indecent and lascivious. The clearest expression of Michelangelo's love for men can be found in the drawings, letters, and poems he created for Tommaso de' Cavalieri. In letters and poems to the young nobleman, Michelangelo wrote that he gave his soul to Master Tommaso, for whom he felt a limitless love. He described himself as being overwhelmed with passion, as if in a deep river or a crashing ocean. Alongside writings, Michelangelo made a series of highly complex and finished drawings for Cavalieri, including this one. Executed in black chalk, it shows the fall of Phaeton. Phaeton's father was Apollo, the sun god, who offered Phaeton one wish. Phaeton asked to drive the chariot of the sun for one day, and Apollo begged him to ask for anything but that. But Phaeton would not give in. Once in the chariot, he lost control of the horses, who pulled the sun too high, causing the earth to freeze, and then too low, and the land is scorched and the oceans boil. To save the earth, the god Jupiter struck Phaeton down from the heavens with a bolt of lightning. Michelangelo depicts Phaeton's story in 3 distinct episodes. At the very top of the sheet, Jupiter sits astride an eagle, twisting his body as he prepares to hurl the thunderbolt. At the centre, Phaeton is plummeting to the earth. His horses are flailing around him, and below at the very base of the sheet, his sisters watch in horror as he falls above them. This myth is one of desperate, overwhelming desire and failed ambition, and the drawing has often been thought to represent Michelangelo's feeling of unworthiness in presuming to love Cavalieri. He knows that he's sort of aspiring to touch this unreachable thing, and it's a love that can never end well. Michelangelo's draftsmanship in these presentation drawings is truly remarkable. He's using tiny stippled strokes of black chalk, building up the figures. And he's using just black, no white chalk is used at all. So all of this, the negative space where he's showing the highlight and the muscularity of the figure's body is a really impressive exercise in restraint. An earlier, sketchier version of the Fall of Phaeton is in the British Museum. This first draft bears a note to Cavalieri from Michelangelo. Michelangelo writes, "If this sketch does not please you, say so that I have time to do another by tomorrow evening, as I promised you. And if it pleases you, and you want me to finish it, send it back to me." The note, and the differences between the British Museum sheet and the completed version in Windsor, suggests that these drawings were, in a sense, collaborative efforts. They were to be revised and honed by both creator and receiver. Though Michelangelo's drawings were intended as private gifts, they were immediately famous. After receiving the drawing, Cavalieri wrote to Michelangelo saying, "3 days ago I received my Phaeton, very well done, and it was seen by the Pope, the Cardinal de' Medici, and everyone." Although he treasured them to the end of his life, Cavalieri made the drawings available for others to copy, both in replica drawings and engravings. And this sheet is actually in an exhibition in the King's Gallery in London at the moment, and I really would recommend going and seeing it. It's just one of the most impressive, forceful drawings that you can imagine. The level of finish on this is just remarkable. And the idea that Michelangelo, who at this time was such an established and famous artist, would be writing so pleadingly and so desperately to the man that he loves, saying, "Please, I hope this pleases you. And if you don't like it, I'll change it however you want it to." There's a sense of vulnerability, which I don't think you often get in Michelangelo's other sort of more forceful works. We'll leap forward to Georgian England now, to a fencing match taking place in Carlton House in April 1787, in the presence of the Prince of Wales. At the left of the painting is the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Saint-Georges was born in Guadeloupe to an enslaved Senegalese woman, and he was sent to receive an education in Paris, where he became a celebrated composer, violinist, and champion fencer. Shown to the right, wearing a full bonnet and skirt, is his opponent, the Chevalier d'Eon. Pinned to their chest is the Cross of St. Louis, an award for exceptional military valor. This is just such a beautiful painting. The colors, the sense of action and of movement. You can almost see the dust springing up from the two fencers' feet as they move backwards and forwards in the fencing match. It is really difficult to construct d'Eon's life and identity with any great certainty, given the many fictionalized accounts about them. They were born in Burgundy, we know, in 1728 to a noble family. From the mid-1750s, d'Eon entered the diplomatic service, acting as a French spy in Russia before serving in the French army during the 7 Years' War. In 1762, d'Eon was sent to London to negotiate the Treaty of Paris to end the 7 Years' War. They remained in England, apparently working to improve relations between France and Britain, though in secret they continued to spy for the French king, who hoped to invade British shores. Though they were reprimanded for importing too much expensive wine, d'Eon embraced the posting, building alliances with the British nobility. In 1763, however, they were fired for insolent behaviour to a superior and were ordered to return to Paris. d'Eon refused to return. Instead, in 1764, to consolidate their position in England, d'Eon published all their diplomatic documents, many of which were confidential, in a book called Letters, Memoirs and Negotiations, a copy of which is now in the Royal Library. The publication revealed French ministerial corruption and made d'Eon an overnight celebrity. They remained in London, receiving 12,000 livres a year from the French king in return for silence regarding the plans for an invasion. But as d'Eon's public profile increased, so did speculation about their gender. At this time, they were living as a man, but there had long been rumours in both Britain and France that Daon was in fact a woman. These rumours developed into intrusive, prurient public interest, reflected in many derogatory portrait prints, and I've included one here from the British Museum's collection. It shows Daon wearing a dress, but with a man's overcoat discarded on the chair beside them. They're stood in a traditionally masculine pose, with the symbol of a Freemasons, of course a very masculine organisation, at their waist. Framed on the wall behind them is an image of Mary Toft, a woman who claimed to have given birth to rabbits, and a claim that was, of course, revealed to be a hoax. It's an image which purposefully undercuts and muddies any sense of a defined gender identity and presents Daon as a charlatan. In the 1770s, Daon published an autobiography, a copy of which is here in the library, and was purchased by George IV. In the book, Daon described their early life and addressed their sex at birth. They stated that when they were born, it was hard for doctors to determine whether they were male or female. Due to this apparent medical confusion and their father's desperation for a son, Daon had been raised as a boy. Keen to return to France, Daon began negotiations with the French king, who stipulated that they could only return if they readopted women's clothing. It's unclear whether this caveat was Daon's, though upon returning to Britain in the 1780s, at the time when this fencing match took place, Daon continued to live as a woman, suggesting perhaps a preference. And I think the use of the word readopted is interesting too, because it suggests not a gaining of identity, but an identity that was always theirs. Though it's tempting to attempt to define Daon's gender along modern lines, it is really important to recognise that the terminology we use today did not exist during their lifetime. Instead, I think Daon's life can be used as a really interesting example to illustrate that rigid gender binaries have never existed. To France now, in the 1800s, where Rosa Bonheur was the leading animal painter of the day. Bonheur was born in Bordeaux in 1822, at a time when it was very hard for women to train as artists. It was quite acceptable for, as a woman, you to be producing genteel watercolours of flowers as a hobby, but nothing more, and you certainly wouldn't have been able to pursue an artistic career. Bonheur was lucky, though. She had two teachers. The first, she said, was nature itself, and the second was her father, Raymond, who was a painter and a member of a socialist movement who believed in the equality of the sexes. Raymond trained all his children in his studio, but quickly recognised Bonheur's ability and encouraged his daughter to pursue a career in painting. Bonheur was incredibly determined. She was desperate to avoid a life restricted to a domestic sphere, and she was precociously talented. By 19, she was exhibiting works at the Paris Salon. Her painting gained international acclaim. It was characterised by its powerful realism and remarkable understanding of animal anatomy. She keenly observed her subjects from life, purchased animal parts from the butcher in order to dissect them, and spent long days sketching in horse markets, in the countryside, and in slaughterhouses, and she writes really vividly of her experience in these places and of standing in pools of blood all day. These spaces were, of course, male-dominated. To avoid harassment, Bonheur obtained a permit from the French authorities to dress in menswear. She had to apply for this permit because at that time it was illegal in France for women to wear trousers. Any woman caught in trousers twice in the same year would face fines or jail time. In very special cases, for reasons of health, you could petition the police for permission and you would receive an official permit valid for 3 to 6 months. During the 1850s, only 12 women received this permit, one of who was Bonheur. Though her permit was granted on the strength of the work she was producing and the understanding that dressing in masculine clothing allowed her a greater level of freedom to pursue her work. Bonheur, though, was very careful not to be photographed or pigeonholed as someone who just wore men's clothing. And when people would drop into the studio, she would desperately quickly try and get dressed back in her skirt and in her full dress. And I wonder whether this was a way of her trying to protect the rest of her life. It was fine for her to be an independent painter. It was fine for her to be an independent painter who was a woman, but an independent woman who wore menswear all the time, maybe she thought that was becoming too risky. As she explained, the costume was a great protection to me. My skirts would have been a great hindrance, making me conspicuous and people making foul remarks. It was far easier to be taken as a young man. It's hard to overstate how successful Bonheur was, not just in France, but internationally. In the 1850s, she toured Europe and was treated as a celebrity. Her paintings were brought to Buckingham Palace to be shown to Queen Victoria, who had an enduring interest in her work. This watercolour of a glorious shaggy donkey was bought by Victoria. Bonheur's lively brushstrokes convincingly captured the texture of this donkey's coat, and you can really see the difference in brushstroke that she's using when you look closely at this watercolour. Sometimes she's using a very dry brush to give a sense of the donkey's coarse hair, and in other places it's a much more loaded wet brush to really build out that beautiful colour of their coat. At the height of her career, Bonheur moved to the Château de Bie, near Fontainebleau, where she established a menagerie in the grounds of her new home. The menagerie included stags, yaks, wild boars, gazelles, and lions, including the one portrayed here. In a book by Theodore Stant, one of her contemporaries, we learn how the animals, great and small, moved about in complete liberty. The artist's unique relationship with these creatures is borne out by Stanton's anecdotes. He describes how the young lions were let loose later in an open courtyard so Bonheur could sketch them. They gradually became very tame, he writes, so that their mistress, whom they were evidently fond of, could caress them. And again, this is just one of the most impressive animal paintings I really think that has ever been produced. It's again Bonheur's range of brushstroke, the range of different textures in this painting, from the very soft, smooth strokes that he used to build up the lion's mane, to the rougher work up at the top of his head. And you really, I think, get a sense of how well Bonheur understood the anatomy of the animal. You get a really good sense of the weight and the shape of that lion's muzzle, and the curl of its lips and its mouth. Rosa Bonheur had 2 long-term relationships with women. She's famously quoted as saying, "As far as males go, I only like the bulls I paint." Bonheur met her first partner, Nathalie Mika, when they were both teenagers, and the two lived together for over 40 years in a house that they named the Domain of Perfect Affection. They slept in bedrooms connected through hidden doors. Their union was supported by Mika's family, and Bonheur recalled that Nathalie's father entreated the two to never leave each other's sides. Nathalie was as driven and independent as Bonheur. She took a keen interest in veterinary medicine, which is a very useful skill for someone who's going to be living among lions and donkeys and yaks. And she contributed to Rosa's work. She would prepare canvases or give them finishing touches. Rosa Bonheur describes their days in the studio together. She writes, "Just the two of us. We never opened the door to any flirting man." Nathalie also regularly acted as Bonheur's agent, negotiating prices with dealers and collectors, protecting her partner's interests. Nathalie died in 1889, and Rosa was thrown into a deep grief. She was utterly bereft. She buried herself in her work and refused to see anyone. She later said, "What would my life have been without her love and devotion? Had I been a man, I would have married her." It was during this period of grief that Bonheur first met Anna Klumpke, an American artist. 9 years later, in 1899, Anna began working on a portrait of Rosa. Out of this work, the two women developed a deep love and formed what Rosa Bonheur described as a divine marriage of two souls. Bonheur wrote a letter to Anna's mother, where she related that, "We've decided to join our lives. You may rest assured that I am quite worthy of Anna's love and that she'll be respected and happy with me." Both families opposed the relationship, their financial concerns likely masking deeper worries about the nature of the two women living together. Bonheur, however, was undaunted and made Anna the principal beneficiary in her will, official legal recognition of the private vows the two women had made to each other. Bonheur's openness about her relationships, the way that she writes to the parents to make it very clear what she's going to be doing, that she will be living with this woman, was remarkable at a time when female same-sex desire was widely condemned. The final two artists I'm going to talk about tonight are Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon. Ricketts and Shannon met in 1882 when both apprenticed wood engravers at the City and Guilds Technical School in Lambeth. They remained together for over 50 years, living a life devoted to art. And this is a fantastic print from the National Portrait Gallery's collection of the two men together. I think you really get a sense of their closeness, of how intertwined these two men became. Both were members of the aesthetic movement, championing beauty as the most important aspect of art. Ricketts worked as a book designer, topographer, and author, and Shannon was a painter and printmaker. And this work here is a view of the Temple of Karnak, painted by Shannon. Both men collected antiquities from Egypt and visited the country in the early 1910s. And this work is really remarkable, I think, for its very subdued tones. It's very sort of thick impasto handling of paint. It's a very beautiful, subdued, strange view of this temple. The two men complemented each other by all accounts. Ricketts, we learn from letters and from friends' accounts, was very lively, while Shannon was quiet and calm. Ricketts was hopelessly impractical, so Shannon prepared his materials for him. Ricketts knows a great deal about flowers, a friend remarked, whereas Shannon asks the name of a buttercup every spring. Their closeness is emphasized in an account from their friend, the writer Edith Cooper. Cooper wrote, "These two men live and work together and find rest and joy in each other's love." Shannon and Ricketts amassed an impressive art collection, which they displayed in their house in Chelsea. They hosted a wide circle of friends, including Oscar Wilde, who described their home as the one place in London where you will never be bored. Their friendship with Wilde was a productive one. Both Shannon and Ricketts produced illustrations and designed bindings for Wilde's publications, and this is a detail taken from the cover of Lady Windermere's fan. Charles Shannon had designed these really exquisitely refined gold petals to be put on the cover. Shannon and Ricketts came to an agreement that they would follow an artistic program. Shannon would retreat from the world to perfect his technique and emerge as a master painter. And Ricketts would work as an illustrator, sculptor, and designer to provide financial support during this period. This process they estimated would take about 5 years, after which the two would swap and Ricketts would retire to hone his style. In 1929, however, Shannon fell from a ladder while hanging a picture and sustained serious brain damage. It's now over 2 months that he's been ill and 6 weeks that he's semi-conscious, Ricketts wrote in the March of 1929. Shannon recognizes me, but lives in an incomprehensible world of his own. He has tried to draw. He had become, Ricketts wrote, a kindly, listless ghost. Ricketts continued to work to support Shannon. In 1929, he designs the binding for the Legion book. This is a book published to raise funds for the Royal British Legion, and it contains some writing and illustration by some of the foremost names in British art and literature at the time, including Vita Sackville-West and Aldous Huxley. And Ricketts designs this incredibly elegant cover for the publication. You really get a sense of how he's embracing Art Deco style and how he's able to put together this incredibly coherent, nested, beautiful building design for the front of this book. By the winter of 1930, however, Ricketts had given up all hope of Shannon's recovery. He writes that "My one consolation is that Shannon seems happy and unconscious of his condition." He continued to stay with Shannon, and he writes really touchingly that if the price for the 40 years that I had with him of perfect happiness is that I now have to look after him while he's in this state, it's a price I'll pay any time. It's an incredibly touching relationship between these two men. It's one that I think is just incredibly sad. Ricketts continues to work, and he publishes Recollections, which is a memoir recounting his friendship with Oscar Wilde. Wilde's reputation had been irreparably damaged at this point by his trial for sodomy and for he was put in a sort of self-imposed exile in Paris. He really, going from the brightest, best spark in England, had just been completely torn apart. Ricketts publishes this volume in an effort to preserve his friend's memory, but he is still aware of how dangerous it is to be linked to Oscar Wilde. So he builds a series of framing devices for himself to sort of cushion and protect himself from Oscar Wilde. He says that he didn't write the book, he instead just translated it, and he invents a fictional Frenchman who had, in France, come across someone who knew Oscar Wilde and wrote down the account that this man had given him. And then Ricketts has in turn translated that. So he really is desperately trying to buffer himself from how dangerous it was to be associated with Wilde and his reputation. Ricketts' effort, though, did much to rehabilitate Wilde's reputation in the early decades of the 20th century. And he also designed the binding for this volume. And it really, again, is just a beautiful, incredibly clear, linear piece of design. Ricketts died in 1931, and Shannon lived until 1937, cared for by a nurse and a servant. Ricketts's obituary in the Times makes clear how interconnected the two men's lives were. For Shannon and Ricketts, the article writes, "It was seldom I think or I do, but almost invariably we think and we do." It's connection and collaboration that I've been thinking about a lot while I've been preparing this talk. I think that because there's so often very little material evidence of queer histories, it's very easy to find these figures and then see them as sort of isolated single instances separated from each other and from queer communities by different centuries, which is, of course, it's not true. They and we are never isolated. Leonardo and Melzi worked together in a studio, both looking at the same drawing and Leonardo leaning over and adding lines to it. Melzi protected and secured Leonardo's legacy by holding on to his drawings. Michelangelo equally discussed his compositions with Cavalieri, possibly refining based on suggestions that Cavalieri made. Rosa Bonheur and Nathalie Micas sat together side by side finishing canvases together, and Ricketts and Shannon's professional and personal identities were deeply intertwined. These were not isolated figures, and I think by looking at their art and thinking about their lives, we are in turn provided with meeting points, with tethers that connect us to the queer community and allow us to celebrate and see the long lineage of our history. Thank you so much for listening.
Oh, Alice, thank you so much for that talk. It was so incredibly wide-ranging and touching on the works of arts themselves, but also the lives of those artists and those really intimate moments and some points of deep poignancy. So thank you for sharing the research that you've done so far. We do now have some time for questions from the audience, and they have been coming in thick and fast. I've been trying to arrange them for you. So the first one came in was about the Chevalier d'Eon, and the question was were there political exploits? It sounds like their political exploits were more shocking than their gender. So is that true at the time?
I think it's a really interesting question. Their political exploits were definitely incredibly shocking. I mean, it's not often that you get a diplomat in England just sort of actively confessing to huge corruption that's happening in their own country. I think that their gender presentation did, however, become something that was incredibly, speculated on and a point of such interest. And I think that they, when they return to England in the 1780s, they make a living off fencing matches. And probably one of the reasons they were able to do that so successfully was because they were, presenting as a woman at the time. It seemed to be something really quite remarkable. And actually, interestingly, a lot of early feminists latch on to Deon as a symbol of female fortitude. Sort of, I think Mary Wollstonecraft writes about Deon and says, like, look at how strong and how great women can be. So there was, there is definitely that positive aspect of their gender identity and the way that it was accepted and looked at. But there was also really incredibly invasive interest into them as a figure. And at one point, people are running bets against their gender. It's something that is of public interest in a way that you really think it shouldn't have been.
Thank you. Then going back to the very beginning of your talk, somebody has asked, are there any inscriptions from Michelangelo to Cavalieri?
Yes, he writes poems for Cavalieri, and he puts inscriptions on the draft drawing in the British Museum. We don't have any inscriptions on the sheets that we have in the Royal Collection, unfortunately. But yeah, his poetry is a really good place to go for an expression of that love. After Michelangelo's death, his nephew takes the poems and edits them to sort of change the gender and make it more acceptable, a more heterosexual expression of love, and publishes that version of them. And it means that for a very long time, this idea of Michelangelo writing to another man was just completely lost, which is, of course, something that happened to Sappho as well. The amount of people who, after poet's death, look at the poems and make them palatable for a heteronormative audience is depressing. It's depressing, yeah.
Thank you. Going into those, the backgrounds of the artists, there have been a couple of questions. One of them was really the image of the donkey. Was Victoria aware of the artist's background at all?
I don't think so. I think that she was aware of her as incredibly talented painter, and that was probably the extent to which her interest and her understanding of Bonheur went. But we know that she sort of went out of her way and sent agents to galleries to buy works by Bonheur. So it was clearly something that she desperately wanted in the collection.
Thank you. You've ended your talk. I could have carried on listening for such a long time, and you've given us a huge sweep of history. But one of the questions that has been asked a few times is are there any contemporary works of art by queer artists that are in the collection that you haven't included, but that you might be able to talk to us about now?
Yeah, I ended up with Shannon and Ricketts because I sort of wanted to think about queer artists as units. But we do have, we have works by contemporary queer artists. We've got a fantastic self-portrait by Hockney, where he's looking at you sort of dead down the camera. And it's a really, again, impressive, calm, confident portrait. And Hockney sort of describes his work as good propaganda. He says that it's always about homosexuality. In an interview, he said this, but it's good propaganda for that. And I think it's really good. We also have a work that recently came into the collection by Isaac Julian, who's a queer artist, and who the artwork is looking at the wife of Frederick Douglass. And again, it's a really beautiful contemporary piece.
Thank you. And so then, having gone from kind of a specific to a more general question, how can people find out more about LGBTQ plus stories in the Royal Collection? You've kindly been sharing some of your research with us today. We know this is an ongoing process, but if people at home would like to go and find out some more, where can they do that?
You should go to our website. In the collection stories part of the website, there's a story all about LGBT artworks and artists in the collection, some of which I didn't touch on today, and it's really worth going and having a look at it. Everything that I spoke about today is online, so you can look at the images and read the catalogue records for those as well.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Alice. Well, that is come to the end of my questions, and so I'm afraid that's all we have time for here. If you'd like to learn more about the Royal Collection, Alice mentioned our website. It's at rct.uk. And if you'd like to be the first to hear about upcoming events, you can sign up to our e-newsletter there as well, and link on our online What's On guide. We will be launching our new digital programme in the coming weeks, so please sign up and please keep an eye out. If you'd like to visit any of our sites in person, you can find all of the visit details there on our website. Alice mentioned the exhibition that's currently on at the King's Gallery in London. That's during the Italian Renaissance, and it's on for just one more month. It closes on the 9th of March. If you're up in Scotland, the next exhibition that's at the King's Gallery, Palace of Holyrood House, is opening on the 28th of February, and that's Royal Portraits, A Century of Photography. And of course, you can always join us for our online events. There will be a QR code on your screen at the end of this event, so we'd love to hear your thoughts. This is an ever-evolving programme, and it's put on entirely for you. So we'd love to hear what you thought of tonight's event, if there's anything else that you would like us to talk about. We've greatly enjoyed spending time with you. It's been a pleasure having your company today. So whether this is the first time that you've joined a digital event or whether you are a long-time viewer, we really hope that you will join us again soon. Goodbye.